Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to The Bridge. You are joining us this week for the first part of a brand new series on worship. Now, if you were joined us last week, Kelly actually introduced the series for us as we were talking about worship. Kelly and I are going to be leading you through the next 3 weeks in a discussion about worship. And what we think has happened in North America is we have really narrowed in how worship is defined, and worship is so much broader than what we view it to be. I think in a lot of respects, for a lot of people, that worship is a time where you sing with a band, and their perspective of worship, and honestly, the church's perspective of worship, is that other people or circumstances or environments can limit your ability to worship. When we dig right in, I think you'll find that that's actually not true. Now, when we look at what worship is, there is an Old Testament context and there's a New Testament context. And as we look at what gets defined as worship, Jesus actually defines what worship is. And we find it in a story that might be familiar to a lot of you. It's a story of the Samaritan woman at the well. And as Jesus is talking to her, there are a lot of interesting things that come out of this exchange. We find it in John chapter 4. But one of the very interesting things, and the things that we're going to look at today, is just the whole concept of worship that gets discussed between he and this woman at the well. We pick up this exchange in John 4, starting at verse 19. "Sir," the woman said, "I can see that you are a prophet. Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain, but you, Jews, claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." And pay attention to Jesus' answer here. "Woman," Jesus replied, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem." Jesus introduces something there that's very significant. Jesus actually describes how there is a transition between Old Covenant and New Covenant worship. But let's keep going. "You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews." This word "from" is very, very significant. It's not worship that worship what we know for salvation is for the Jews. It's that it's from the Jews. And Jesus is describing the salvation that he brings as a Jewish descendant, and a descendant of David and a descendant of Abraham. He carries on, "Yet a time is coming and has now come." Jesus says it's actually started already, has now come, when true worshipers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. And you got to catch that the whole dialogue that Jesus is having here is, the question is, where do you worship? Is it on this mountain or is it in Jerusalem? And Jesus says it's not in a specific place. Now, the whole idea of worshiping in the Spirit is a conversation. There are several opinions on that. And we could talk about this for a very, very long time. But what the emphasis is that we're going to be looking at today is just that worship has shifted from the Old Covenant to the New Covenant. It is about worship in the Spirit and in truth, rather than having to worship in a specific place, whether it be the Bridge Community Church building in Bancroft or the temple in Jerusalem. Worship is not confined to a specific space. And then Jesus says this: God is Spirit, and his worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in truth. Now, truth, that is the Greek word that's used for truth, the definition is not just speaking the truth, but it's broader than that. It's about sincerity or authenticity, that worshipers will worship with authenticity and sincerity. Sometimes, and I got to be careful with this, because sometimes the words that we say with our mouths in the songs that we sing for worship do not reflect our real life experience. We may say that we will follow, but do we follow? We may say that we love God with everything, but do we really? What Jesus says is that true worshipers will worship in the Spirit. We're going to look at that. Not, but in sincerity, with authenticity. Those are what God desires, for God is Spirit, and God's worshipers must worship in the Spirit and in sincerity. See, Jesus clearly states that there is a difference between Old Covenant worship and New Covenant worship. And if we don't grasp this, we will be looking at some Old Testament passages, Old Testament Psalms, and singing them, trying to apply them to our circumstances. Many of the Psalms were written, several of the Psalms were written for different occasions, for occasions like the songs of ascension, which were sung by pilgrims who were coming up the mountain, up into Jerusalem, for one of the 3 pilgrimage festivals that would happen each year. Some of them were sung to call on God, songs of prayer. Some were songs of thanksgiving. They were all different reasons, and we can use them in our worship today. But when we look at the complexity of worship in the Old Covenant, it was directed to a temple. It was directed to a very specific place. And that's why Jesus says, that the Samaritans, they worship on this mountain. The Jews, they worship in Jerusalem. And Jesus says that a time is coming when that will shift. And we need to understand that as we worship as a new covenant community, as a New Testament church, as a Christian church. Now, what is interesting, and one of the most interesting passages when it comes to worship, we can find Paul, who is writing to the Romans, who are not Jewish in their traditions at all. And Paul is writing to them, helping them to understand what true worship really is. And he starts this off in Romans chapter 12, verse 1. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. You notice that Paul doesn't say anything about singing a song. He doesn't say anything about gathering in a specific place or having a specific setting or mood for worship. Paul says that true worship is offering yourself as a living sacrifice. You know, the thing that we often miss when we even look at Old Covenant worship is that worship always requires a sacrifice. Always requires a sacrifice. And Paul points out that when we worship in this new covenant experience, when we worship in light of Christ, the proper worship, the proper sacrifice is not something that's killed and burnt on an altar. The proper sacrifice is directing our lives as living sacrifices. This is true, remember, authentic, true as in sincere, proper worship. And then Paul goes on to describe exactly what he means by this. Verse 2 says this, do not conform to the pattern of this world. What's interesting, when you look at how Jesus taught about the patterns of this world, it was always about how people interacted with other people. He always pointed out how his followers were to be different. He talked about how if you're giving to the poor, don't announce it with trumpets. Don't make a plaque. In fact, he said, as my followers, when you are giving to the poor, Give in a way so that your left hand doesn't know what your right hand is doing. Do it in a way that is not serving your pride or your desire for honor, but do it in a way that is serving the needs of the person you are giving to. Don't make a big deal about that. That's one way that he says, okay, don't conform to that pattern of glory seeking in your giving. You conform to a different kind of thinking when it comes to giving. Just give. He says, as he's talking about leaders, he says, you know those Gentiles, how their leaders lord over them, they desire to have power? He says, not so with you. If you want to be great in my kingdom, you need to be a servant of all. The pattern of this world is to build yourself up and gain power. That's what everything in life is focused on. But he says, don't conform to that pattern, conform to a different pattern of servanthood. He says, you know those religious people, they like to sit in the most honorable places, sit in a seat of honor, be honored by those around them for their righteousness. And Jesus says, not so with you. You look for a seat that is more humble. Consider others to be more honorable than you. Don't conform to the pattern of seeking honor or power. Don't seek to fulfill yourself with your service. Do your service for the benefit of those you are serving. And he says, so if you're going to do this, you've got to change your thinking. So Paul says, do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. In other words, think differently. You know, another thing that Jesus had said, he said, you know what? If somebody slaps you on the face, he doesn't say stand up for your rights, fight for your rights. He says turn the other cheek. Jesus also said, if somebody takes your coat, well, offer them your shirt as well. It's not about protecting your stuff, standing up for your rights. This kingdom that Jesus is calling people into doesn't conform with the patterns of the world, but we need to transform our thinking. We need to focus on others rather than focus on only benefiting ourselves. Transform by the renewing of your mind. Think differently. And then you get this, because this is really important. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. Have you ever been in that state where you are asking God, so what am I supposed to do? I don't know how I can make a right decision. What is the right decision? God, will you lead me in making this decision? And Jesus says to you, says, well, start with, let's not focus on you in this decision. Let's focus on what is the greatest benefit to the kingdom in the decision that you're about to make. Jesus challenges us in our thinking. We jump down to verse 5 as we're looking at this. And remember that Paul introduces this in the context of worship. He says, this is what worship looks like. No mention of gathering and singing. It's all about offering yourself as a living sacrifice. So in Christ, we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. Each member belongs to all the others. God didn't gift you in a specific way only for your benefit. God gifted you in a specific way to benefit those in the kingdom of God who are around you or around the world. He gifted you in a specific way to serve his kingdom. You know, Jesus always responds to us serving him by serving others. It was interesting, and you may recall this, we've looked at this passage many, many times, but somebody comes up to Jesus and says, so what is the one greatest commandment in the Bible? What is the one thing that we should do? And Jesus responded with this: love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. And this is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it: love your neighbor as yourself. And as Jesus is saying this, he isn't saying this is one and this is two. He is saying you asked for the greatest commandment. It comes in two parts. Love the Lord your God with everything by loving your neighbor as yourself. We always worship through a temple. And Jesus in the new covenant has changed the temple from this building in Jerusalem to the people around you. We've got to grasp that if we are going to truly understand what worship really is. Now, back into Romans chapter 12. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. Have you ever thought about how you benefit from the people who are around you? Have you ever thought about how awesome it is that God has brought certain people into your life? That's the grace of God that comes through someone else, through the gifts of someone else. And when it says we have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us, the grace given to each of us may come from someone else's gift that we reap the benefits of. And the reverse of true as well. The gifts that we are given are by the grace that is given to us as a community. And that the gift that you possess is for the benefit of all of us who are in the community. And the gifts that I possess are for the benefit of all of you in the community as well. It's by God's grace that He has placed you around different people with different gifts. It's just the way God made us. It's not because we deserve the specific gifts we have. It's because God made us this way for the benefit of other people around us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. And if it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Do you catch that we are to practice the gifts that we have been given? But when Jesus saw people giving gifts and then seeking honor for that, He says, yeah, there's no reward in that. You're just giving for the benefit of your own pride and your own honor. There is no value in that. And when you lead, well, don't do it like the Gentiles. Don't do it to gain power and control of people. When you lead, place your power under the control of someone else. This is what Jesus says. He says, the greatest among you will be servant to all. Place your leadership abilities under the control of someone else. It's an upside-down kingdom. It's not conformed to the patterns of this world. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. I love this. As it carries on, Paul says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourself. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. We're serving the Lord by being devoted to one another. We're serving the Lord by honoring one another. This is real worship. It's not about sitting and singing a song. Though we can sing in worship, we can teach through worship, we can pray through worship, but real worship must be done to benefit the community around us in a way that happens. Paul continues, verse 12, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. Bless those who persecute you. Bless and do not curse. I have found it really interesting during this pandemic, the number of things that get written off or described as Christian values, as Christians continually beat up the government that we're told we're supposed to support or listen to or obey. Christians are angry that they don't get to do what they want to do. And everything in Jesus' teaching is opposed to those attitudes. We're not here to fight for our rights. We're to turn the other cheek. We're to love people into the kingdom. Honestly, what people describe as religious persecution during this pandemic, when other institutions are experiencing the same limitations or more limitations than the local church, it just is not what I view as Christ-like. It doesn't imitate our Savior when we take on those attitudes. Paul continues, rejoice with those who rejoice, mourn with those who mourn, live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Be careful to do what is right in the eyes of everyone. If it is possible, and I love this, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. I love how we recognize that we can't control other people's opinions of us. All we can do is, as far as it depends on us, we can do our best to live at peace with everyone. And we jump down. I'm skipping over a few verses. You should read through Romans chapter 12. In verse 21, it says this, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. So, as Paul describes worship, it is always in service. Worship always requires a sacrifice. So what keeps us from doing what we're called to do? What keeps us from being able to serve others? What keeps us from being able to turn the other cheek? What keeps us from using our giftings to serve the kingdom? It's a really good question, and there are all kinds of answers for this. Worship is so much bigger than sitting in and singing a song. Worship is not an emotion. Worship is being a living sacrifice. So what keeps us from being that living sacrifice? What makes us defiled in terms of worship? What defiles our worship? Jesus has this discussion. He's getting beat up a little bit because his disciples are eating with unclean hands, and there's questions about what they can eat and what they can't eat. And Jesus responds to that in a very interesting way, because all of a sudden the conversation is not about food at all. He says, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it is from within, out of a person's heart, that evil thoughts come. Sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, and folly. All these evils come from inside and defile a person. What keeps you from serving? What keeps you from doing what God has gifted you to do for the benefit of others? I'm pretty sure that much of it comes out of either one of these things that defiles your heart's ability to worship, to be authentic in worship, to serve others, to think of others more than yourself. And this is not about beating yourself up. This is not about destroying yourself. This is just recognizing that God has gifted you in some very powerful ways, that the church is weaker when you don't exercise them. True worship requires sacrifice. Worship requires sacrifice. It always has. What we fail to completely capture when we look at Old Testament worship, when they would gather for their festivals, is the stench of burning flesh that was around there. People that would have to sacrifice animals from the flock, sacrifice something. It cost something to worship. And when you sit in a church service and sing a song, especially if it's in a type of music that you enjoy and you can close your eyes and reflect in, there is no sacrifice in that. It doesn't measure up to what is authentic worship. Now, Kelly's going to talk about creativity, and I believe that music can be a significant part of worship or a vehicle for worship. But music in itself is not worship. Worship requires sacrifice. And Jesus says that true worship is a spiritual thing that happens, it's expressed out of authenticity, that is expressed out of sincerity, true worship. Worship requires sacrifice. Now, I know what it is like to be alone in solitude in some of the beautiful places around here. Some people say, yeah, that's where I worship, and I would challenge that. I would challenge whether that's really worship. You see, meditation, reflection, prayer, many other things can be practiced in solitude, but true worship happens through a temple. True worship happens through a temple. Under the Old Covenant, true worship was performed through sacrifices at the temple in Jerusalem. But for us, it's no longer through the temple in Jerusalem. True worship happens through the New Testament temples of one another. And that's what Paul is talking to us about in Romans chapter 12, that true worship is sacrificing ourselves, going out of our way for the benefit of others in the kingdom. Sometimes that can happen through teaching. Sometimes that can happen through prophesying or serving. Sometimes that happens through giving. And as Paul describes this, he says we are all gifted in different ways for the benefit of everybody in our Christian community. So I want you to think about this. What is a true pathway to worship? How do we worship then under this new covenant experience? Well, number one, you use what you got. Here's a question for you. What are you good at? And you can go, no, I'm not good at anything that would be useful at church. And I would say, if you are a Christ follower, stop lying. God has gifted you in a way that will benefit our community. God has gifted you for the benefit of our community. What are you good at? Now, you can say, and honestly, it's not your fault necessarily that you've grown to think that church is all about preaching or singing or stuff that you do on Sunday mornings, because the church has focused on those things. But that certainly is not the church. The church is so much broader than that. Some of you are really good at making money. You know, some of you are really good at making apple pie. Whatever it is, those things that you are good at, what are you good at? The next question is, how can you use it to benefit God's kingdom? There are many ways. If you are good at making money, what would happen if tomorrow you went out and you said, okay, I'm just going to focus today on making money that benefits someone in our kingdom? There are people in need in our community. What if you just spent a day trying to support them? What if you're really good at even just telling stories? What if you're really good at just connecting with people? What if you're really good at building? What if you were to just take the things that you are good at, and instead of trying to build up wealth for yourself for one day, you were to do those things to benefit the Christian community around you? Now, I know that if everybody at the Bridge Community Church were to do what they were good at for the benefit of the kingdom, even for one day a week, we would be overwhelmed with the blessings of being in a Christian community. But here's the thing. What keeps you from doing that? What keeps us from doing what God has gifted us for the benefit of the entire community? Well, part of the problem is that we've conformed to the patterns of this world. We drank the Kool-Aid. We think that our abilities are for the benefit of us, and we've lost focus on the fact that they're for the benefit of God's kingdom. That list of what defiles us, there's probably something in there. I mean, pride can kick in. You can say that I'm not good enough to do whatever, or worry. Maybe you're afraid that your gift or your abilities won't be honored. And Jesus would say, why are you looking for honor? Just do what you're good at. Do it for the benefit of my kingdom. That's the worship I desire. God calls us to worship Him by serving His children. Can we do that? Of course we can. God has gifted you in a way that is meant to serve His kingdom. So, can we do it? Yes. Are there opportunities to do it? Yes. Always. Make your own opportunities. What stops you from doing it? Anything that is opposed to God's will for your life is what keeps you from doing it. God has designed you for this purpose. He's gifted you for this purpose, and He will give you a fulfilled life if you walk in this purpose. That doesn't mean that it's easy. It just means that it's meaningful. I want to close with this passage, Romans 12, the first two verses out of the Message. Kelly read it to you last week. I want to read it to you again because I just love how it's said. So, here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. The things that defile you will no longer defile you. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it, unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity. God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. And that's what you were called to. And that's what God desires as an offering. And that is your true sacrifice. So I leave you with this. What are you good at? How can you use it to the benefit of God's kingdom, and what keeps you from doing that? God is calling you to true worship. Sometimes I think that we have reduced what we call as worship as simply feeding an addiction for a certain style of music on Sundays. In fact, to some extent, I find it a little bit offensive that there is even a certain type of music that is a worship genre. But I like that genre. I'm just saying it's so much broader than that. Sometimes people walk away from a gathering because they say they can't worship in that gathering, because the atmosphere is all wrong. Something's wrong with the spirit, when really, I think it's just not feeding the emotional addiction they have for a certain type of experience, because nowhere in the New Testament is worship described as a feeling. Nowhere is worship described as something you can do in solitude. Worship is defined as something that requires a sacrifice, doing, offering. And that offering that you have is something that God has already given you. Serve. Follow God's leading in your life with the abilities He has given you, and become a living sacrifice that He desires you to be. Come back next week as Kelly is going to lead us in a discussion just about the creative aspects of how we can worship through creativity. See you next week.